session on taking a stance on calming waters, challenging established science. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read out the biography for everyone on the panel. You have them in your programs here. I should say we have a transatlantic panel of talented individuals and passionate speakers. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Dominic Dyer, Chief Executive of the Badger Trust. Thank you. You can speak.
Okay, well, thank you. It's a real pleasure. Thank you very much. My name is Dominic. I'm Chief Executive of the Badger Trust and also Policy Advisor to Care for the Wild. It was very interesting to hear what Ian had to say earlier about the balance of being a chief scientific advisor and dealing with very difficult, complex issues in government. I spent my time in government for many years. I started in the Ministry of Agriculture when I was 17. I've also worked in the food and agriculture sector and in the science areas as well, particularly in plant science. I have a lot of sympathy with what Ian was saying about the debate about neonicotinoid insecticides. I spent a lot of my time working on that issue around Britain and around the world to see if we could reach a balanced debate on the benefits of those technologies, balanced off with the disadvantages of removing them for the environmental concerns that we're familiar with. But what I want to talk about this morning briefly is the badger cull. I am a believer in science, but I think the badger cull policy is fatally flawed. I don't believe it's a good science-based policy. I believe it's a policy that's been largely driven by short-term political and economic interests. And I think it's actually putting people like Ian Boyd and Nigel Gibbons, the Chief Veterinary Officer, in a somewhat difficult position in government. You said, Ian, earlier on that it's your job to try and calm the waters, and the golden rule is never to become part of the problem. I would say that you possibly have become part of the problem. You are working alongside a politician, in my view, who is clearly cherry-picking evidence, that has a clear political agenda to deliver a policy that the Conservatives in opposition had developed, and I was familiar with that with the National Farmers Union and other organisations. I do believe, this is a piece of science-based research, randomised badger cull, that you're familiar with. 11,000 badgers were killed, £50 million was spent. No science is definitive, I wouldn't say it is, but I think it's a good starting point. And the people that were involved in that particular study, like Lord Krebs and others that I've worked with and spoken to over the years, I think reached some very, very important conclusions. That killing badgers, as we've been doing in Gloucestershire and Somerset last year, will make no meaningful contribution to lowering TB. If we don't get 70% of the target figure, which we failed to do by the methods we put in place, we could reinforce the disease in the badgers and we could force disruption of the colonies and we could move that disease around. And there's a high risk, I think, and I think hopefully, Ian, you would agree with me, that we could have potentially made the position in those counties worse, and we're going back in to do more potential damage this year, in my view. There are alternative policies. I think we are beginning to get on top of this situation in bovine TB by tighter biosecurity measures, by tightening up cattle control movements, by improving TB testing, by looking at how we actually do farm in this country in terms of the number of cattle movements and how we can use science and innovation to improve TB testing methods, something that I'm going to be joining a discussion at and looking forward to at Trent University this afternoon. And that's what I believe in, a science-based approach. If someone said to me that killing badgers in the way we have would directly deal with the problem, it could be done humanely and quickly and efficiently, then I would be willing to consider it. But I have seen no evidence to indicate that's the case whatsoever. To subcontract out shooting of a protected species in the way we have to pest controllers with minimum scrutiny last year and no real scrutiny in terms of an independent panel for this year, which is the subject to our judicial review we lodged in the High Court yesterday, I think is a terrible step backward for DEFRA and its reputation, a terrible step backward, I think, for science policy making in government, a hugely damaging issue, I think, to the farming industry. And I think it's resulting in significant public concern across this country. And I spoke to tens of thousands of people up and down this country in the last 6 months, in towns and cities from Bristol to Manchester to Leeds. We had nearly 1,000 people in Dorchester this weekend. This is the biggest animal welfare wildlife protection campaign we've seen in Europe in decades. And we are bringing people together who've never demonstrated about anything in their lives before, but feel passionately that government have got this wrong and are asking very, very serious questions about why we got to this point. Why isn't the science, in their view, being listened to? Is there too much influence being brought to bear by the farming industry? And is that in turn being played on by the politicians who are obviously looking for votes when it comes to elections? Now, it's a difficult position that you find yourself in, I appreciate that, but I think there is a crucial role for independent scientific advice. I think there's a crucial role for a precautionary principle. I think you're right about neonicotinoid insecticides, to take the position you have, and some people criticise me for holding on to the views I had when I was Chief Executive of the Crop Protection Association, but they have not changed. But I will stand firmly by the concerns that people have about this badger cull. I think it is fatally flawed. I think it's the wrong approach. And I think we also underestimate the public. You often talk in scientific and policy circles about this by looking at other countries. Ireland's a country I know well. My mother's Irish. I spend a lot of time there. They have killed significant numbers of badgers, maybe 50-60% of their population of badgers. They've done so in ways using snaring, shooting and gassing techniques which are largely considered inhumane and I don't think would be acceptable to the British people. Yes, they have lowered TB, but it's debatable as to how much the killing of badgers has played a role, combined with the biosecurity and cattle control and TB testing measures they put in place. But Ireland is a different country. You haven't got tens of thousands of people marching up in towns and cities in Ireland saying that they are concerned about killing badgers. We have a long tradition of care and compassion in this country for wildlife protection. That's why the RSPCA started here. Compassion in World Farming started here. WWF started here. Some of the most recognised environmental animal welfare organisations around the world. This is not Ireland. It's not New Zealand. It's not America. And what we have to do is develop policy that can command the respect and confidence of the British people and take into account their care and compassion for wildlife. I do think we have an opportunity to combine effective badger vaccination that can work, and we should be doing more of it. And I've got volunteers at the moment working in the Badger Trust in the fields, working at the moment to put down cages, to put traps down, to get badgers vaccinated, and I think government should support that in a larger way than they are. I think we need to move forward with cattle vaccination programs. I think the Welsh Government are keen to get those trials from Ethiopia to the UK. The sooner we can make that happen, I think that will be better for everyone. And I think we need to look at what we're talking about at Trent University this afternoon. How can we more effectively look at the testing systems, reliable testing systems for TB in cattle and in badgers? Now that will throw up a difficult issue for us. You know, I'm already having to deal with concerns being put at my door about the fact that if you are able to accurately test the badger for disease in a trapped situation, would you remove it? Well, I would tell you we would remove it, yes. And we'd do so humanely as part of a trap and vaccination program. We wouldn't return it into the wild. If we could accurately get to a situation where we can test those animals, and I think we will, then I think that would command the respect and confidence of a vast majority of the British people. That's got to be a better approach than this non-targeted shooting of these animals in an inhumane way. The independent expert panel that you set up told you was inhumane to go on this year. So I want to really just put that out here today. Science is important. Balancing public opinion and concern is important. Getting to grips with the problem. And the final point I would make today, Ian, really, which concerns me, you put a slide up today very briefly on bovine TB, and you made it clear that this is a growing problem, rather than saying, actually, it's beginning to come under control. We are seeing some significant reductions, examples we've seen in Wales over the last 5 years, 48% reduction in the number of cattle slaughtered for TB. In the UK, in England, 13.6% in the last 12 months, because of those tighter measures that you're getting farmers to take that we know work. That would be the approach I would have taken today. We've got tough decisions to take, but we are beginning to get control of this problem, and those farm biosecurity measures are the most effective way of doing it. Back that up with a scientific approach for vaccination of cattle and vaccination of badgers, and we will solve this, and we'll solve it without killing these animals. And I think that would be a great example to dealing with this disease to the rest of the world. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Professor Roger Pielke, Junior, from the Centre of Science and Technology Policy Research at the University of Colorado. Boulder. We have some slides.
I hope so. All right, I'm going to go very fast here. It's a pleasure to be here, and yesterday was fantastic. I put up this first hypothesis partly in response to some of maybe the negative tenor of yesterday. Media is bad, science is bad, communication is bad. In fact, I'm very positive. I think we live in a golden age of the democratization of science. I can't explain what I mean by that, but I'm just going to put that out there. Maybe we can talk about that in the discussion. Let me give you a short little story, a personal story. This is a graph that appeared in the IPCC, the last assessment report, 2007. It's a graph that shows temperature in red and disaster costs in green, both going up, both apparently correlated. If you go to the scientific literature, you won't be able to find this graph because it doesn't exist. The author of this graph admitted that he made it up and slipped it in here because he was going to do research in the future that would show this. It's cited to a paper, though, Muir-Wood et al. 2006. This caught my attention because that paper I commissioned for a workshop that I held with Munich Reinsurance, and it had nothing to do with what this graph shows. And the author explained of the IPCC report that they miscited it so that they could get it into the report. So I discussed this, I put this up on my blog, I commented it was in the Times here in the UK. And 1 week later, Foreign Policy, which is a big deal magazine in the United States, put out its Foreign Policy Guide to Climate Skeptics. And there was me, who had studied climate change for 20 years, advocated action. I'm right between James Inhofe, if you know who that is, and Christopher Monckton. And they explained, for his work questioning certain graphs presented in IPCC reports, Pielke has been accused by some of being a climate change denier. And that kind of kicked off a cottage industry of delegitimization of my work for causing trouble in the science of climate change. Now, some of you may be familiar with my book, The Honest Broker, and I outlined 4 different roles for scientists, and I'm able to explain them all. But the case that I'd like to make is that, this is very consistent with what we heard from Ian Boyd, many scientists tend to gravitate to become advocates. They think that engagement and communication means championing a cause, whether it's small p political or big P political. And what I'd like to suggest that in many areas, what we actually need from scientists is leadership, to be what I call science arbiter, to be a resource to give fair-minded questions that policymakers have without putting their thumb on the scale or advocating a course of action, or helping policymakers to understand the different courses of action they could take and their consequences, again, without championing one or the other. Sometimes you just want to know, what are my options, rather than telling me what to do. All right, so I have some examples here. I illustrate this in my book with a choice of where to go to dinner between an expert and a decision maker, and there's different ways that interaction can occur. So in The Honest Broker, I talk about the difference between what I call tornado politics and abortion politics. Obviously a US example, but I would say that in some cases, we heard this yesterday, in some situations, the linear model of science, the idea that you have a factual base and it compels a decision, it does exist. So if a tornado is approaching this building, all we would want to know is it coming this way? Is it going to hit us? Let's talk to a meteorologist or someone with some scientific expertise. The reason that works there is because we have shared values. We all want to live. So if we hear that the tornado's coming, we'll go to the shelter. It's not that there's no values. It's just that we don't see them because they're shared. In a lot of cases of decision-making where science and politics intersect, scientists in particular tend to frame every problem as tornado politics. The idea that if only we had the facts, then the course of action would be obvious. The reality is, and that this graph is obviously from Ravitz and Funktowitz, Post-Normal Science, most of the things that we care about are not tornado politics. They're in fact highly uncertain, contested certainties, and conflicting values. So trying to pretend as if scientific information will compel a decision actually can make the situation worse. So there are tame problems and wicked problems. And politics, if it's a tame problem, it doesn't become political. We solve it, we move on. If it's a wicked problem, we muddle through and it's with us basically forever. So here's my second hypothesis. And this is a little bit longer, and hopefully this will provoke some discussion. And this is the sort of thing that gets me in trouble with my scientific colleagues and members of the media. Many science and media elite and their extended peer communities, usually online communities these days, have used this new golden age of the democratization of science for self-indulgent purposes. So more precisely, so this is jargon from my book, and I'd be happy to talk about it in more detail. They've engaged in overt and stealth advocacy in pursuit of narrow interests, when instead leadership is needed in the form of science arbiters and honest brokers. I think that the scientific community in particular has abdicated its role as a leader and has actually gotten down in the trenches and decided that it's more fun to wallow in the mud than show a way forward. Here's an example. So how many climate denialists could you fight off? There's the scientists, there's some American scientists and politicians that they're laying waste to. The reality is that the battle over climate science in the media, amongst the public, that battle is over. You may not like the outcome, but at this point it is just entirely self-indulgent of the scientific community to continue to engage in this debate. So I'll leave you with that. Here's how you can find me, and there's more there. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is to talk briefly about another animal issue, the contentious topic of the use of animals in science. It is both contentious and contestable. I just want to have a couple of words about sort of mapping out the area and some of the issues that are up for discussion, and then I'd like to just talk briefly about the Boyd Group, which is a forum for dialogue on the topic. Just first to say then, laws on animal experiments are enabling laws in which they give scientists license to do things that would be illegal under general animal welfare legislation, which immediately opens them to challenge. However, they don't give carte blanche, rather they set out a framework, which you can see here, for making judgments about what is and is not acceptable or in law permissible. And of course, these are all contestable judgments. And I've just quickly, mostly through overexcitement with a new laptop, added a few points of questions that could be made, and this could be tripled or more. I'll add them up quickly, and then you can take a quiet look at them. It gets boring. So these are all questions that one might want to address related to the general framework for weighing up and thinking about these questions in law. And of course there are many others, all of which are unified under that general question of the moral justification and scientific justification, because this is a scientific issue as much as a moral issue for doing the thing in the first place. The judgments at the moment are made by researchers, animal care staff, vets, institutional ethical review bodies and government. There's rather little opportunity for input from the public, in the broadest sense from publics. Sometimes public representatives are on the review bodies, the local review bodies. Animal welfare organisations are occasionally represented, and there's no anti-vivisection input at this level of decision making. So these are all topics that the Boyd Group has addressed over the years. The Boyd Group was founded in 1992 by Colin Blakemore, who many of you will know as the leading animal researcher, and Les Ward, who's Director of Advocacy for Animals in Scotland. They got fed up of trading sound bites on public debating platforms and decided that they wanted to meet in private and try to delve behind the rhetoric, which I think is a laudable aim, but very difficult to achieve in practice. Indeed, the first meetings took place in secret because of the sensitivities involved. 1992, the debate was highly polarised and somewhat dangerous even still at that time. These are the objectives of the Boyd Group, so I'll leave you 10 seconds to read, given the timing issue. You'll note, if you've had a chance to read it, that it is not an aim to bring consensus. It is merely to lay out the arguments and identify points of consensus where they occasionally arise. So we're bringing together anti-vivisectionists, animal welfare groups, scientists from academia and industry, funding bodies and others with an interest. And increasingly now we're trying to bring in people who look in from the outside, such as social scientists, philosophers, to give us a new take on the issues. There are benefits and difficulties. So my first point is about the benefits. Of course, bringing a wide range of people together is an important benefit in this area, I think, an opportunity for people to engage in measured discussion. That, of course, is also a difficulty, bringing a wide range of people together in this area where there's so much at stake, and if you hold a categorical position, setting that aside in order to debate with people who hold different views is not something that can be done lightly. Ensuring balance in the discussion is therefore always an issue, and we can often navel-gaze about how we can bring in more of the radical people who hold the absolutist views. However, we do make progress, and understanding the reasoning behind the rhetoric has certainly benefited a lot of the scientific members, and I think is very important in making progress. Setting aside campaigning genders is very difficult if you're an organisation that makes its money and progress by having a campaigning agenda. And creating an open, trusting environment in these times is also difficult. The question of representatives or individuals for these groups is also a difficult one. We want people to set aside their campaigning agendas, but that's very challenging. The challenging part is definitely in every meeting, and thinking about how that makes an impact on policy, it's a very tenuous link perhaps, but one that we feel is making a difference. Also, though, on the other side of the coin, we have the question of whether people come along with an open mind or they're just coming often to sit in the meeting and check it all out. Is this actually making progress? So we need people who are genuinely interested, engaging, prepared to learn, and potentially change their, not necessarily their fundamental views, but at least to make practical progress. Finally, and this is really always a difficult thing, how do we show that we are worthwhile in doing this? It's a very part-time, sort of slight hobby for me, really, this. But even so, we really want to make this something that makes a difference. And it's very difficult to evaluate in terms of outcomes. How to justify the approach. We have had some, we believe, influential inputs into policy, but it's always difficult to show the benefits of those. And finally, one tiny point about openness. I mentioned how little opportunities there are for publics to input, or even animal welfare organisations in a structured way. And certainly, in terms of public input, it's very difficult because this is a notoriously unopen area in terms of not so much the benefits, but the harms to the animals. It's something that the new openness agenda, I hope, will progress, and I know there are people here today who are running research projects on that and would hopefully contribute to these things. I hope that's raised some food for thought. Thank you.
Our final member of our panel is Professor Stephen Turner, Distinguished University Professor of Philosophy from the University of South Florida.
Yeah. So I can't speak that fast, so I'll say less. Okay, my title really comes from a famous statement misattributed to Bismarck, which was that if you wanted to have respect for either laws or sausages, you shouldn't see them being made. And so I want to talk about that in relation to science a bit. Now, as a sort of philosopher of science, what's fascinating to me about this discussion is the long history of some of the images of science that have cropped up in this meeting already. And one that strikes me as very important is a kind of big division that is especially important in science education, which we haven't really talked about. But it's basically this. You teach people who aren't going to be scientists some elementary science and then teach them to revere scientists? Or do you teach science in terms of the history of science as a human enterprise and so forth? This played out in a very interesting way in the history of Harvard, where the president, the scientist, James Conant, who's one of the really mysterious but central figures of 20th century life, imposed or developed a kind of science curriculum for his students who he expected to be decision makers and leaders that wasn't designed to teach them elementary science and to revere science, but rather to understand how scientists work. And that's a really big distinction. So they had a very good story, and his peers also had a very good story about science as a kind of self-correcting enterprise, a community, didn't depend on individuals, depended on criticism and scrutiny in labs and so on and so forth. And that image of science, especially pushed by Michael Polanyi in this country, is sort of behind a lot of our pictures of science as a kind of community that's self-correcting and is kind of a magical truth machine because of its institutions. So this was really, it is kind of a left versus liberal story, and I won't go through the whole history here, but Auguste Comte had a saying, there is no right of conscience in astronomy. By which he meant that, well, if you were wrong, we could just get rid of you. And he wanted to apply this principle to everything. He thought, social life, we could find the laws of sociology, and then we'd find who was wrong, and so on and so forth. And this is really, there's a very intense strand. If you read Carl Pearson, he actually talks about, in his letters, hanging people from the lamppost if they didn't accept the scientific truth. bit of echo of certain people in climate science nowadays. Okay, so the liberal view, this late liberal view, is science is this fallible enterprise governed by norms and blah, blah, blah. Okay, this is all very familiar. The problem is that it's no longer true, or it's an image of science that depended on a lot of conditions, such as independent finance. So the very first talk here, there was this between curiosity-driven science and other kinds of science. But this is completely anachronistic. This really goes back to their view of science, but in fact, the major curiosity that scientists have is about where they're going to get their next grant. And they have to figure out how to beat the system, how to pay their postdocs, and all of this sort of stuff. To call that curiosity-driven is surely a kind of a misnomer. So what we have now is big science, very money-dependent science. It's a complex financial system, lots of pressure to produce results, and lots of institutional means to generate results, but a complete dependence on outside funding resources for almost all scientists. So my mother was a clinical medical professor, and she had to publish some stuff. And so she did her little cancer research with slides in the basement when I was a little kid, and there were little punch cards and so forth. It was a very antique system. This is just inconceivable now. It is so far in the past, but that's where the picture of these independent scientists actually came from. So what do we have now? There didn't used to be any talk about consensus. There was talk about textbook science. Now we've got orientation toward problem solving. There's a huge amount of regulatory science. There's a lot of corruption, which I won't bore you with, but a few years ago I was at the Council of Biology Editors meeting, and they described the absolutely incredible kinds of events that they, as editors, had experienced, including people would discover their name on a journal article that they had never seen. Some drug company had inserted it into the literature for it, or something was put in as an abstract just so it could be cited. And the whole issue of credit and so forth is just unbelievably complex. Well, this is all more or less a result of big money science and all of this sort of stuff. Okay, so what I think is a big problem for, say, science journalism or talking about science is how do you talk about the new thing that science is? Yeah, okay. And there are no easy answers to this. There's a lot of money involved. There are a lot of conflicts of interest. There's a lot of secrecy. It's very difficult to deal with it. So, what might be a model of journalism for this? Might be something like financial journalism, which actually recognizes all of these issues. And where does that actually happen? Well, I think it actually is happening in a way in pharmaceutical journalism. So there are a bunch of websites. There's a lot of beginning of investigative reporting. There's a lot at stake in big pharma. And so there at least you get a much more realistic picture of trials failing, rumors tracked down, discussions of financing, much more explicit than anything you see in the rest of science. So maybe something like that would be a good replacement for the way that we talk about science now. So thank you.
Thank you for our panel for injecting some passion into a slot just before coffee break, which is always a good thing. We have about half an hour for questions from the floor, so if you want to ask some questions, put your hand up and our roving microphone will come and find you. So let's start. If you could tell us who you are and where you're from. And if you can think of questions that are for more than one person on the panel, that would be much appreciated as well.
Good morning. My name is Ivan Laffaire. I'm talking not as a scientist or a researcher, but more as someone that has been involved in the past in animal welfare. I founded an association when I was doing my first degree back in Portugal. I worked with Careta Turtle, the Tuna Dolphin Safe Stamp, actually in a partnership with the University of Florida, the Iberian Wolf, the Iberian Donkey, and whales. My question goes to Dominic Dyer. I share his concerns, honestly. I share his concerns because one thing that really scares me these days is that the first sign that one has no idea how to control a problematic agent is when one decides to kill it. And this is what we've been doing, and this is so 1938. It's so extreme, it's so criminal. How can we end up this once for all? Because this is meaningless, this makes no sense, and just reveals ignorance from the government bodies that they're not capable of dealing with such problems. Thank you.
You know, the concern I have really about the badger, and since I've took over at the Badger Trust a few months ago, I've gone up and down the country and spoken to badger groups and writers and people that have been involved in looking at badger ecology and behaviour. It's an incredible species. It's lived in our isles for about 500,000 years. And we've had a very difficult relationship with it. You know, if you look at the agriculture workers of the 18th, 19th century, they used to sort of dig them out of the ground and bait them and put them in inns for dogs to fight with them. And then we had a terrible period in the 19th, 20th century when colliery workers particularly started to get more organised with badger baiting, which to a degree led to the protection the animals got in the early 70s because large numbers of badger sets were being destroyed up and down the country. And today they're being demonised again to a degree because the farming industry has a genuine problem. You know, bovine TB, as Ian is very familiar with, is a long-term problem that we have in our farming industry. It's a result to a degree of changing in farming methods, no doubt. The first recorded badger with TB, I think, was in 1971. If you looked at the 71 onwards, you know, we've had a significant industrialization of our cattle industry. We move something like 13 million animals a year now. The numbers of cattle herds, on average, a farmer will maybe have 200-300 cattle in many cases compared to a much smaller number, for example, in the 50s and 60s. There's no surprise that a disease such as bovine TB will spread in those circumstances. You know, I almost see it as a form of industrial pollution in the sense of TB have gone into wildlife. It's happened. And then there's a certain amount of wildlife going back into cattle. We're not certain of the level of infection from badgers to cattle. But I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm not saying it's not a genuine problem and concern for farmers. I understand it is. You know, at the farm gate level, when you lose cattle to bovine TB, it's a significant economic and social problem. You know, you're losing cattle that you've maybe invested an awful lot of money and time in, who maybe got a very productive life ahead of them. You've got to prematurely slaughter. Yes, you do get compensation, but it will be under the market price. So it's a very difficult issue for many farmers to deal with. And these farmers often not making an awful lot of money. They're in an industry where they've seen that the value of milk and meat that they produce driven down by supermarkets to provide us with this sort of cheap food that we to a large degree take for granted. So my sympathy definitely lies with them, but I think the demonisation of the badger is not the right way to go. And in recent months it's got worse. I can't understand why we took the research on TB in cats and suddenly ended up on the front page of the Daily Mail. Maybe you can explain that to me, Ian, but there seems to me some political spin at work to have generated a story where you had a small cluster of people that could have caught TB from their cats. We're not certain where the cats got TB from. It could have been from rats and feral cats or whatever other interaction. But suddenly it definitely became a badger. It was on the front page of the Daily Mail. The badger looked like a Tasmanian devil, you know, and it was going to come out and bite you. I think it was more like a honey badger from Africa than a European badger. And you know, suddenly everyone starts worrying about that. And then you get the hedgehog debate. Yes, hedgehogs are under real pressure, but they're under pressure because of use of agrochemicals, modern farming techniques, the way we use hedge strimmers, the way they get killed on the roads, the way we put fences across our gardens. Badgers do take hedgehogs, but not in massive numbers. They're not going devouring our whole population of hedgehogs, but again, that emerges into the press as being a key factor, and the NFU and others are jumping up and down saying we should kill badgers because they kill hedgehogs. And then we come to bees. You know, I spent all my time in the crop protection industry talking to beekeepers up and down the country, across Europe, the Middle East, America, trying to get to grips with the complexity of how we use pesticides and the implications for pollinators. The issues that, you know, Ian's mentioned today, very complex, very difficult. I never talked about badgers destroying large amounts of bees. Yes, they will take ground nesting bumblebees, but it's all part of a picture that's been created. And it is almost medieval. It's almost going back to the 19th century when we created a vision of these animals. And that really, really worries me. And the bottom line is we have huge persecution problems. The level of persecution, I met with the head of the police in the Isle of Wight on Monday, and I've lived on for a few years some time ago. And we were talking about increasing levels of persecution to the degree that, people were pouring petrol down badger sets and setting them alight. We were finding badgers by the side of the road that were being skinned, physically had been skinned and left by the side of the road. We've got increasing cases of badgers being illegally poisoned and gassed by landowners, by farmers, by gamekeepers, by individuals who might just feel they're justified in some way of doing this because of all this demonization they pick up about these animals. To me, that's absolutely tragic. It's illegal, and we do what we can to get those people to court. And I would much rather, Ian, I'll be honest with you, spend all the money that we're going to spend in the High Court, which there'll be hundreds of thousands of pounds on the judicial review, getting people to court for badger baiting, because it's horrendous. But we're having to fight with government to try and bring a stop to what, in my view, is a policy that is not science-based, is inhumane, it's cost £10 million overall last year to police that cull and to administrate it. That's more than any wildlife cull I can find anywhere in history. And it hasn't helped farmers. And farmers ring me now and ask me, why is it we can't find an alternative? We can and we should. What we do need is leadership, and the science community must lead that debate too. And I think they've been too quiet, and I think advisors in government have been too quick, in my view, to throw their weight behind the politicians to take those short-term political decisions, which I think are damaging. So it's a long answer to your question, but I want to get across to you the weight of concern I have on those issues. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. Would any of the other panel like to comment on the more general thing about when you start killing things, then you've lost the control argument? Is there any other species that you can share? I've heard a lot about badgers and anything else that you can have friends across the pond.
I can't think of anything they kill. The environmental protection laws are so intense that even the threat of extinction of some obscure thing shuts down big projects. So it's the badgers. There are not enough left to worry about, but they seem to thrive in certain places.
Okay. Another question.
On the question of whether scientific advisors need to not stir the pot too much, it's one that interests me a lot. I think I can have sympathy with Ian Boyd's case, because the questions he's dealing with are ones where the evidence is not really very good. In other cases, there are cases where the evidence is very good. Take the fake bomb detector. The Department of Defense were promoting this obvious fake detector for years after they'd been written to point out that it was an obvious fake. Where the hell were the scientific advisors there? They did nothing. They resulted in people being blown up by their inactivity. So that's a pretty clear-cut example. I mean, homeopathy is another example. The University of Wales is actually shut now because it was closed down because it was running a racket in validating about 1,500 external degrees and everything from a traditional Chinese medicine in Barcelona to fundamentalist theological colleges in Denmark. But it wasn't shut by the QAA or the Ministry of Defence. It was shut by, well, first me blogging it, and then BBC Television Wales, Kieran Jenkins, making programmes about it. After that, the QAA suddenly woke up and said, oh, it's not too good. They spent £90,000 sending 5 people there for something you can tell in 10 minutes with Google without leaving your office. And it's the activists were actually what did it. And blogs and television, far more effective than any scientific advisor in government.
Thanks for that. Would the panel like to comment on that, the role of activists in shaping policy and getting governments to act as opposed to science?
I quite liked Mary Midget, but funnily enough, it's taken me right back because it was a talk here in Nottingham about, I hate to say, probably nearly 20 years ago, but she talked about the 2 tribes of activists. The ones who look in from the outside and create a fuss with the protesting, and those who come in quietly, perhaps in my area, the ones that get engaged in debate, are welcome in laboratories, would be organisations like the RSPCA particularly, and Universities Federation for Animal Welfare. And then you have the major anti-vivisectionists who are the other tribe, essentially, who shout from perhaps, and also come with scientifically based criticisms. But actually, in a way, never the twain shall meet, it's almost as difficult sometimes to get dialogue between those two groups. Certainly historically it has been. And her argument was that we should bring these together. And again, I'm obviously reflecting on the things we try to do, but we do try to bring together these different groups to make progress together. And I think the key question, as I mentioned, is also about openness, about access to information. And without that, with your putting the information about the things you've mentioned on the table publicly would have helped. And unless we have adequate information that sets out all the facets of the argument, we won't ever be able to make progress on these challenging issues.
Much of this would never have come out without the freedom of information.
But yes.
The FOI issue is interesting here. I don't know how it works in America because you have a freedom of information act. It'd be useful to hear from the other panelists. But I think in Britain, people are beginning to understand how they can use that system. So for the Badger debate, the FOIs have flooded in. I know there's probably civil servants working night and day trying to answer them all. But the fascinating thing is that people are educating themselves based on the information they're getting out through FOI. They're dissecting it, sharing it with the media and organisations like ours, and beginning to peel away the sort of skin of the onion, as it were, of a government policy. Now, that's just for one area I'm involved with. I actually think that will cause difficulties for government and for policymakers, but I think long term that's not a bad thing. It means that actually maybe those who originally dreamt up the freedom of information process are starting to see it come of age, and that within the means of using online technology to make your request quickly, get information back and share it, we're beginning to really see a new approach, I think, to campaigning and trying to question policy and influence it, for whatever issue you're dealing with. I don't know how our American colleagues see that.
Well, I think my view is that the government is becoming very clever at resisting. At first they were responsive, now they're really good at figuring out reasons why they can't give you that information. It takes a long time, takes longer than you, makes it useless to you, and so on and so forth. I think it's all the way through the system. They've just gotten good at resisting.
So as time has gone on, it's become more of a block, you would say, in terms of how the bureaucrats can. We're maybe at an earlier stage in the process.
Yes, it's a dialogue.
The ways around that is that you try, just imagine trying to do a freedom of information case.
Okay, let's move on to that question. Maybe someone over this side of the room.
Thank you, Ruth Dixon from Oxford University. Well, it goes back to Ian Boyd's, almost his first comment was that the stock of science in decision making is declining, and he blamed that on the scientists' communication, as far as I understood, rather than the policymakers. And is that scientists, is that true in the first place? I wondered what the panel think about that. And if that's so, has science communication got worse to explain that, or have other sorts of communication got better, more voices being heard? Just wanted the panel's comment on that.
So the question about science communication, I'm 10 scientists, I'm an engineer, but are we a lot worse than we used to be?
Well, there's something embedded in the entire idea of science communication that for me, brings up the idea of the deficit model. That if only you communicate better, then people will do X, Y, or Z. The silly formulation is if only you had the facts as I have them, you would share my values. So I don't think it is communication. I think there's something deeper, more fundamental. I think it has to do with the institutions of science. And we have different roles. And to get back to the last time, advocacy is great. I mean, that's fundamental to healthy democratic processes. We want strong advocates. We have one on the panel to make a strong case. But I don't want to hear about badgers. And if I want to learn about badgers, I probably am not going to go to advocates on either side. What I would like to do is to go to a scientific advisory process, one that opens up a space for a healthy conversation, both about knowledge, bringing in different types of knowledge, different knowledges, but also different discussions of possibilities. What can we do? The defining feature of advocacy is it seeks to close down options, usually to a preferred option that you've decided upon. Science and policy analysis are about opening up space. So in important respects, advocacy and science advice are not particularly compatible. And the problem I see is an institutional problem, is when the Royal Society gets into a campaigning mode as it did a few years back with respect to ExxonMobil on climate change. Or the IPCC endorses the Kyoto approach, which is a failure. Then the question is, where do you go to have experts open up space rather than try to close it down? So I think that's the conversation. It may be ultimately it gets to communication, but it's what you're communicating through the institutions that you create at that boundary between science and decision making.
You know, from looking at it from a broader experience from when I worked in plant science industry, you often would go, and I did remember going to Monsanto once in the US and spending a few days there looking at all their technologies and speaking to their sort of chief executive, Hugh Grant, and key people in the business. And it just struck me that this company had achieved so much, but it was still struggling with a reputation of Agent Orange being deployed in Vietnam in 1968, which actually wasn't even responsible for, but these sort of video images were continually played when people would have a go at the business and what it was standing for. And I remember having that discussion with that company and others saying, you've got some of the most cleverest scientific people in this business, and you're carrying out a lot of technological development that whatever people think actually is going to be beneficial, in my view, to mankind long term. But you can't communicate yourself out of a paper bag. You know, you're being run around by small NGO groups that have one issue and often demonize your business and what you stand for and do it very, very effectively. And I think that's part of the problem in corporate culture too. It's not just scientists in government. Actually, you have many very clever scientists working in corporations, but they're very focused on the projects they're dealing with. They're not skilled in communication. They're not outward looking. Often if it is handed over, it's handed over to a sort of advocacy, public affairs team that are not often very effective at it either. And that doesn't help when you're trying to deal with difficult debates. You remember when I was discussing the neonicotinoid insecticide issue, I'd often go and speak to beekeepers in large enough groups and have a long debate with them about the benefits of plant science technology and food security and the regulatory systems, the $200 million we'd spend or whatever to get these products to market and all the tests that we would have to approve, environmental public health tests. And if we took this technology off, we'd have to replace it with something that maybe was older and less efficient and would actually have a bigger negative effect on the environment. And you would win those people around. You could see you were engaging with them and they were beginning to open their minds and they went out of that room thinking, actually, there's more to this than meets the eye. And I sometimes think that's what you have to do. And government some way has to probably do that more effectively. Business has to as well. But we do need those debates. You know, you need to challenge orthodox opinion. I'm on a different side of the badger kill debate because I think the orthodox opinion to a point was we kill badgers, everything will be fine. I don't believe that's the case. We need a broader science debate on that. But when it comes to plant science, it's a different issue.
That's one thing.
Hi, I'm Dave Farmer from the University of Nottingham. I had a question for Roger, or maybe a clarification on the points you made. So you made a point about sometimes we can get a bit self-indulgent when we're sort of communicating science. The example you gave was sort of, I understood it, continuing to attack climate change deniers when actually, you know, the scientific evidence is pretty overwhelming now. I'm not sure if that is self-indulgent though, because the point is they're still there. I mean, Ian said he works for a guy who's in charge of the environment and denies climate change, as I understood it. That's pretty worrying. So as long as those people are still there, if they're still holding those views which are against what we understand as scientists, I'd say it's almost our duty to keep attacking. I mean, if I've got a friend who's trying to sell a homeopathic method, you know, remedy for cancer to another friend, I'm going to tell them that they're either ignorant or evil. It's I don't really see that as being self-indulgent. It's fun, I'll agree that, you know, it is fun, but I don't see it as being necessarily self-indulgent. So I was wondering what your thoughts on that were.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I'll give you two different answers. One is, and I'll quote Walter Lippmann. Walter Lippmann was a journalist in the United States in the early 20th century, and he made a great point about politics. He said, politics isn't about getting people to think alike. Politics is about helping people who think differently to act alike. So if your goal is for everyone to think alike, then, you know, good luck to you. It's not going to happen. But if your goal is to actually do something about the accumulating carbon in the atmosphere, I can tell you a number of different strategies that have nothing to do with science that will be appealing to this minister, to Midwestern farmers in the US, to poor Indians, that have nothing to do with acceptance or rejection of science. For example, in the United States, if you can build a big pickup truck with a lot of horsepower, a lot of engine power, and it doesn't produce any carbon dioxide, and it's cheaper than a gasoline pickup truck, problem solved. And you don't have to go to the science. So that's what I mean by opening up space. Now, if any particular scientist wants to attack homeopathic medicine or climate change deniers, great. You know, use your time as you see fit. it's self-indulgent when it gets to the point that our leading institutions actually participate in that. Not everyone has to be an honest broker or an arbiter of science, but someone has to. And what I see is that if the bench scientist wants to blog and attack and say nasty things, great, good for them. But when it shows up in the New York Times, the pages of the Guardian, the National Academy of Sciences and Royal Society, we've lost something really important in our communities.
That's what people see. That's the point. If you've got people denying it in these forums, which they do, then there needs to be an opposition voice in these forums as well. Otherwise, I'm not talking about getting everyone to say I agree that that's never going to happen. But if you're just letting one set of people influence it, we can sort of say, well, we know we're right, so we don't need to come back and say anything to them.
But what's the end point? So in the United States, and this is documented in my book, the public opinion on acceptance of mainstream climate science and also acceptance for the need for action has been 65 to 70% for more than 20 years. And it fluctuates. The thing it correlates most with is the weather. Right? If it's cold, it goes down. If it's hot, it goes up. So what does that have to be? 80%? 87%? 90%? 98%? If you look in the political science literature at where public opinion sits when major action is taken, climate change is right in the sweet spot. There is no threshold that compels action. So if you look at the bailout in the United States, financial bailout, 15% approval. The Iraq War, 60% approval. There were major actions taken. So public opinion is not limiting. So yes, I would say, believe it or not, let the climate skeptics lie. Focus on those sorts of actions that will make a difference. And I think you will see, number one, science will gain stock, but also we might make progress because this battle with the skeptics will go on forever.
Woken up on this side. That's great. I don't know whether we've got the activists all over here. People going, no, it's nearly coffee time over here. So can we have another question from us? Sorry, I'm making the person with the microphone run around now. Okay, we'll go there.
Stuart Parkinson, Scientist for Global Responsibility. I want to talk as a scientist who works in a campaign organisation and works with campaigners in other organisations. And I guess this whole idea of calming waters or taking a stance, I think you can't make a simple. You can't have a simple answer to that question. And sometimes you have to take a stance, and sometimes you have to calm the waters. And I think it does depend on the situation. I also think it depends on how you do it. For example, the example of the previous questioner who said we should call people who believe in homeopathy evil. I think that's exactly a great example of what you shouldn't do as a scientist. It's when you start being arrogant and using some of those very inflammatory terms is that you will lose public sympathy. And I think that's when climate scientists have come undone, and I speak as a former climate scientist and have very strong views on the need for action on climate science, is when climate scientists have been too arrogant, too patronising, and too didactic in many ways. It's when they start to lose it. They haven't taken enough notice of thinking on communication, the literature on communication of science, and some of the things that Roger Pielke was talking about. But I also think there are certain areas where you really have to jump up and down as a scientist. I work on nuclear weapons issues a lot because we've forgotten how dangerous nuclear weapons are. Issues of accident, they're still here. Issues of accidents, issues of use, times of confrontation is very great. And we have the government and the scientists who work in that area have a very narrow view, won't debate a lot of the issues, won't accept a lot of the policy discussion, and you have to jump up and down a great deal. And I think it's very important that we have scientists working in both those areas in those different ways, and I wouldn't want to damp that down at all.
Okay, thanks for that. Let's take the other question and then we'll hand over.
I'm a Alexandra Stelmach. I'm a PhD student here at Nottingham, and I have a question to Professors Pielke and Turner. Given the way science works right now and the institutional setting of science, how easy do you think it is for scientists not to engage in advocacy? Because being in the media, being in the public eye, and trying to advise governments can both stimulate promotion, but also it may settle debates within the science, especially in the fields where there are lots of controversies.
Okay, thanks.
I'm not sure I follow your question, but I think it is just the case that scientists are going to be in the public eye, and in this sort of new model of science, they're promoting their own research and the value of their area, and they are public figures, and they're paid to be public figures. It's just a change in the way, in the role of scientists. So, you know, in a way, this conference wouldn't have made sense in 1950, but it makes sense now because of the change in the nature of science. And so we're still, I think, you know, we're still working out the details of what this new form of science is, and this is just one aspect of working out those details. I think they're on the epistemic side, and there are also aspects, but this is one really important aspect.
Yeah, so when I wrote my doctoral dissertation in 1993, and at that time you could read all of the congressional hearings on climate change that had ever been done. They started in about 1978. You can't do that now because there's been thousands of them. But what struck me at the time was, so the scientist gets up, they give their presentation, radiative forcing, blah, 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 carbon, blah, blah, blah. And the first question that policymakers ask is, what should we do? And I think that places scientists in a very difficult position. Number one, how many times do you have an opportunity to tell the US Congress what you think they should do? But once you start asking that question, it's way outside the expertise of the scientist. So I think that it's incumbent for leadership in the scientific community to develop institutional capability to help decision makers answer that question. What should we do? Because asking any scientist, as brilliant as they are in their area of expertise, what we should do is probably going to lead to an uninformed answer and just pure advocacy. Oh, I think we should stop selling cars, you know, and then the politician says, you know, how do I get this guy out of here? He obviously doesn't understand the issue. So I think it's part of the training of individual scientists, yes, to be sensitized to these, but the scientists need to ask their professional societies, but also the big organizations like the Royal Society, the National Academy of Sciences, to actually serve that function in the community. And we don't do that very well right now. Instead, actually, the big institutions jump into the advocacy ring more often than not on a lot of issues.
Jane, would you like to comment on whether you should jump up and down or calm the troubled waters?
Well, I think there's a role for both, really. I mean, certainly on the animal experiments issue, whilst the tactics of some of the anti-vivisection organisations were not only outrageously poor at times, they also, in effect, I think, diminished their credibility towards the end with the guinea pig farm. I've forgotten the name of the woman, but there was a grave dug up. And that really was, I was going to say the nail in the coffin, but that's an inappropriate metaphor. Anyway, however, I do think that without pressure from outside, without activism, and it's a truism really to say it, there would not have been the progress that has been made, certainly. But then you need the people who also work from the inside out, and it's an incremental progress there. I mean, I'm just describing the situation as it is, but I think we need both firmly.
I'll make one comment. One of my papers was rejected on the grounds that I'd cited someone, and the reviewer said that they were an activist, not a scientist. And I took exception and said that because they'd be both at the same time.
Right.
Yeah, we'll have one more question, I think, before coffee.
Thank you.
Thank you for your patience. It was spot on.
Absolutely fine. Hopefully it'll try and get rid of some confusion I have. So Roger, yesterday we had a very heated exchange, engaging exchange in terms of the politicization of science. And Daniel, I don't know if he's still here. Oh, he isn't. That's a real shame. Got attacked, I would say, in a reasonably nice manner about his views, you know, that science, what scientists should concentrate on was, the scientific facts, for want of a better word, and that you could truly disconnect the scientific facts from the politicization. Now that seems to me to be exactly what you're advocating in terms of an honest broker, that we should be disinterested observers. I'm a physicist. We should be disinterested observers, and our job should be to do exactly what we should do in everyday scientific life, which is to disinterestedly weigh up the evidence. Am I wrong? Because I'm confused.
Yeah, all right.
And yesterday you also tweeted that you could never really disconnect the scientific
No, you can't. So I would say I agree 100% that you cannot disconnect facts from the politics. You can't. But you can set up institutional procedures to limit and manage that intermixing. So the question is, all right, so what should we do about badgers? If I'm going to ask that question, I don't want disinterested scientists. I want all of the stakeholders around the table. I don't want them to come to a consensus. I want them to come up with a list. Here's a set of 10 options that'll take you to different places that span the interests of this honest broker group. I would like to know what the options. So if I ask you, where do I go to dinner in Nottingham? I'd like you to give me a list.
So why is that different from saying you want the scientific evidence untainted by politics?
Because that, I'm making the politics explicit. The politics are folded in there. The advocacy groups are going to say, here's the values that I care about for this outcome. I give that to the policymaker. They're elected, they have constituents. They're the ones who integrate the facts and the values in the form of a decision. All I'm doing is providing them with choice. Yeah, but as you've heard on issues, there's multiple realities, right? There's going to be different interpretations of the facts. So I'm sure
that still doesn't mean that the facts don't stand. Easy go MC swears
sure.
it's a fact.
Sure. And if you want to ask a question, so what's the danger of nuclear radiation? You'll put together an expert committee, but you will want to have diversity there. And if you're doing it right, you're not going to say, tell me what the consensus answer is. You'll tell me.
What is an honest broker?
Honest broker. So, honest broker tells you options. So if I want to know where can I go to dinner tonight in Nottingham, give me a list of the restaurants. Don't tell me where to go. The honest broker would give me that list, right? That's different than a science arbiter. So if you say, all right, we want to know how fast is the speed of light, if you're relevant. Well, don't get caught on this, man. It's
okay. I think I've done a this one up. I'm aware that a discussion at the moment has been untainted by coffee. That's a situation that should be remedied as quickly as possible. Before that, we say a big thank you to our panel for